is there benefits to being neurodiverse if you're in entrepreneurship in terms of your performance?
It does kind of show that some symptoms may display differently while on a different kind of career path.
People never think about it, but a lot of the people who have ADHD are leaders. And if that's you, we see you. Let's bring neuroscience into the space of leadership. Hello and welcome, everybody. I am super excited today because I have somebody chatting with me that some of you will not have met, but has been a big part of what we do. Today, we are talking with Taylor. She is a researcher who has been working with us on our team. So she's been helping to find a lot of the papers. And so I thought, why not have her on as a guest and actually talk about some of these things that she's been researching. So welcome, Taylor. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no worries. And before we get started, do you want to just take a minute and just tell people a little bit about your research background? Like, what have you studied?
Yeah, of course. So my background is in clinical psychology. I've been with unconventional organization for almost 2 years now. So it's mainly about ADHD symptoms in adulthood. Very cool to me. I've also done some research labs, in undergrad and graduate school. And those are kind of focused on like stress, like eating behaviors, things like that, like kind of diving a bit more into the clinical side of psychology.
Yeah, and I'm so excited to have you here because clinical was kind of where I got my start as well. So it's cool to have someone else on that train. And yeah, so today what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be focusing on burnout and ADHD and coming up with some practical strategies to help with burnout, both if you're in a workplace and then also if you're running your own business, because both of those spaces can really be a struggle. And, one of the things I wanted to kind of pull right at the beginning was the research into the fact that people with ADHD do struggle a little bit more with these kind of burnouts, which I think on some level, when you have ADHD, we all know that that is the case, but it's always good to just have the research back it up. So there's two papers here. One looks at stress and work-related mental illness, and this paper from BMC Psychiatry in 2022 found that basically some of the challenges of working with ADHD was that people with ADHD did tend to underperform professionally when stressed and actually had more days of sickness compared to adults without ADHD. So if that's you, just know the research backs you up on this. Like, this is a thing. There's also another paper called Executive Function Deficits Mediate the Relationship Between Employees' ADHD and Job Burnout from 2024. So this one is hot off the press. And they found that adults with ADHD face significant deficits in executive function and have adverse work-related outcomes, which, we don't love talking about the negatives here, but because we are going to be going into practical strategies, I thought it was worth just mentioning that this research exists as well. And what I will say for those of you, obviously we're not therapists, so we are not going to be providing any of those strategies. If you're really struggling with this kind of thing, obviously make sure that you talk to a therapist, but we're going to be providing some of those practical strategies for you in this episode. So let's jump into it. Are you ready, Taylor?
I am, yes.
Awesome. So the first paper really comes from Gabrielle and colleagues from 2022. This is actually from Business Horizons. This is less of a ADHD specific paper and more of a burnout paper in general. And we actually moved a little bit further afield for this because we wanted to focus on giving you guys the strategies that you needed rather than just giving you the information. So we've moved further away from the ADHD research space for this one. And what they basically wanted to know is simple. What can create a healthier workplace for their employees? So Taylor, take us through how they did this one.
Yeah, so with this paper, the main question was how can we create a healthier workplace for the employees, essentially. Their method, they synthesize a lot of different literature and they made that into kind of actionable steps for organizations to take, to foster that healthier, that happier, and that more productive workplace. So with this evidence
Mm-hmm.
and recommendations, they allowed the organizations to thrive not only like with crisis times, but also in non-crisis times, especially, we had COVID-19 relatively a few years ago. So it's still relevant, I would say. But typically with this
Mm-hmm.
paper, though, they summarize the causes of burnout. They make it into actionable recommendations that we can kind of look through together.
Let's pause on that before we jump in, because I want to just take a second and sit on how they did this first, because you said that they went through the literature. And so I'm curious to know, do we have any evidence? I'm just pulling up the original paper here on what they actually did to find these papers. Like, how many papers did they go through? They don't actually have a lot of research on that here. I feel like maybe these kind of business papers are less methodologically focused than the psychology papers, actually.
I could say the same. Yeah. It's more talking and less tables.
Yeah, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, we definitely have gone through some pretty crazy tables.
But yeah, I do kind of like they lay out the paper where they talk about burnout. They introduce it. And then their next one
Mm-hmm.
is why does burnout happen? And it kind of talks a bit
Mm-hmm.
about that.
So they go through the papers, but they didn't give you like the total number of papers they found or why they excluded them or anything like that.
Hmm.
Interesting. It's like a cultural difference for for subject methodology. That's so funny. Okay, so they synthesize literature. They don't tell us how, which is fine. I will let that go. Leave my neuroscience hat on, and they basically went and said, okay, we want to focus more on the practical outcomes, which I do appreciate. I think that is really, really important. And maybe if we're going to be honest, psychology doesn't do that as much. So, what were some of the practical outcomes that they did come up with?
As I was saying earlier, they kind of define burnout. They talk about why does burnout happen. And one of the funny things to me was it's kind of recognizing that it's not surprising that employees don't just wake up one day and they're suddenly burned out. It's a gradual process.
Yeah, good point though.
Yeah, because then it kind of, heightens the need for these recommendations, these kind of implemented guidelines for not only the employees, but the employers to kind of, just help in the workplace and make it healthier. I did like, they do have a table of sorts. It's more of a graph, but it's talking about like the job demands resources model, which is, looking at jobs demands versus job resources. And it's talking about engagement and burnout and engagement and then apathy as well. So it's really looking into it. Not so much with tables, but it was an interesting look. And then, they move into the evidence-based recommendations to kind of prevent, combat the employee burnout and things of that nature. So in terms of, their actionable kind of recommendations, I know that specifically, they mention 5-1. So the first being, providing that stress management intervention.
Did they say what stress management intervention was from their perspective?
Yeah. So when you're talking about stress management, I don't think they specifically have like, oh, do this and do that. But some examples could be, just embedding like resources and training to help the employees kind of cope with stress proactively, such as like maybe mindfulness or meditation programs. That could be one specific one. And then, with allowing the employees to be more active in their craft, they use that word in their work rather. But, you're not thinking of the employees as a machine, but more so like artists in their vision, I would say.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, I thought that was nice. But job crafting, it's about giving them kind of the independence, the autonomy to shape their own roles, their tasks, and even their interactions at work to maybe better fit some of their strengths, their interests, and things like that. Maybe even lead to less boredom, more engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, moving along though, 2 of the 5. The third one was more of so like cultivating and encouraging some social support. So that could kind of lead back into the stress management intervention, having the social implement of it. So humans are social creatures. We all know that, and a supportive workplace is a powerful buffer against a lot of different stressors during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't,
Mm-hmm.
a happy hour, things like that offered. It's kind of just fostering that genuine, that high quality relationships between the colleagues, the managers, and also the team. So
That's an interesting one, actually, because when I think about this stress management and letting people craft their work and social support, I think this is where the conversation about ADHD really comes in, because how people with ADHD would like to craft their work in terms of their strengths. Obviously, their strengths are going to be a bit different from neurotypicals. And then also how they want to connect with other people might be a little bit different. Maybe they don't want to sit in a meeting. Maybe they want to like go and do something active together. So I wonder, and we will see more because we're going to actually talk about a paper on neuro leadership that I'm excited to talk about. But there needs to be this sense of, okay, we're going to craft their work and we're going to encourage social support, but people might do it differently from what we're expecting, and we'll have to be okay with that too.
Yeah, I really like that point you mentioned because I mentioned earlier COVID-19, and I'm not going to get stuck on that, but this kind of goes into not so much telehealth, but also just working at home. Having that less connection with the team, and kind of wondering, how can we not force a meeting together, but how can we kind of just offer some things where the team can get together and foster that
Yeah.
genuine connection.
What does that look like in a hybrid world? I mean, I think this is becoming a big issue now because everybody is talking about having to go back into work. I work from home. I'll be honest. I love a work from home. Sometimes I wish I had an office I could go into, but I definitely don't wish that I just worked in an office. That was like my nightmare scenario in terms of distraction when I was working.
No, hybrid is definitely the way to go. I completely agree. I work full time at home, and it gets quiet, But back on the topic though, in cultivating, encouraging social support, a big emphasis on the managers, the supervisors, the shift leaders, the leaders of the team, essentially being more empathetic, kind of understanding multiple different perspectives of their team, and just building trust among them.
Yeah, trust.
Yeah, trust is a big one. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I did like the idea about decision making, like engaging them in decision making. With ADHD, we can struggle with decision making and paralysis. That's a big thing that we teach in our program. But I think there is something, I mean, we've done research on this in the past. Like if you're allowed to, in some ways, create or make decisions about your own environment, it feels a bit less trapped, to be honest.
Yeah, it definitely does feel like less of an entrapment, feeling like you have a voice that matters among the team, and just kind of involving the employees in that decision to affect their work, and also just affect their sense of control and their value on the team, I think, as well. So maybe offering chances for feedback, maybe involving them in the planning kind of strategy of themselves, but asking input makes them feel more a bit invested, I would say, just from, this kind of section and what they're talking about. But lastly, their last recommendation for a guideline would be just implementing the high quality performance management. And what does that look like? Because performance management can sometimes or occasionally or most of the time cause stress, right? So, but when done well, it's about the clarity, the fairness, the development, not just judgment. So, regular feedback, clear expectations, opportunities from growth can, significantly kind of cause that reduction in stress and boost morale even of the team.
Yeah. No, it's very cool. I will say, I'm going to give it to this paper. They did not tell me at all how they got their data, but they definitely gave me a ton of practical strategies. So I'm going to take it back. That table use was actually really good. In case they're wondering.
It definitely is different from like your neuroscience kind of favor versus business.
But yeah, very practical, which we love. Hey, you listening to this podcast. If you like what we do and you want to hear more of it, there is one way to make sure that happens. Please go ahead, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We have been told 5-star reviews can help us to get seen by more people, which means more people are going to learn about ADHD strategies.
Just press the button. Just give us a 5-star review.
The next paper is an amazing one. I was really excited to read this the first time because it's just called Neuro Leadership, a New Way for Happiness Management, which is very cool because I've never heard of the term neuro leadership. And I'm still curious about it, but it's from the paper Humanities and Social Sciences. It's from 2023. So what they wanted to know was basically, they wanted to know, and I feel like I wanted to know too, what do we know about neuro leadership and what role can neuro leadership play in happiness management in the workplace? Do you want to take us through, Taylor, what they did?
Yeah, of course. So I was also very interested in this paper just because the word neuroleadership, the words happiness management, not thrown around too much in research nowadays. I think we're moving kind of into that since it is, 2023 paper. But in terms of what they did, they used a mixed kind of methodology. So they used like the bibliometric technique and in-depth kind of analysis. And
yeah, what is the bibliometric technique? Because I had no idea about this one.
yeah, so I know that they can manifest across like two different categories. So we're looking at performance analysis as well as kind of some science mapping. So in essence, there's the computations, of research constants. So science mapping focuses on the relationships of the research essentially. But yeah, so more of like an in-depth analysis and logical reasoning applied to propose this research roadmap and present the pathways for neuroleadership and, this management overall.
So what is neuroleadership in this context? Can you give me a definition?
Looking at their definition, I would say they kind of emphasize it as, strengthening the field of leadership with the support of neuroscience findings. That was important because this concept, it's developed under the leadership of a specific individual. They know David Rock. And, they're defining kind of the social cognitive neuroscience. They say it's kind of a subfield of neuroscience, it looks like, and attempts to kind of understand and comprehend a little bit more of the human interactions in a social, cognitive, and neural aspects.
Interesting. So they're kind of saying, let's bring neuroscience into the space of leadership. And what that does, and the reason this is very cool, is it kind of does open up more neurodiversity conversation as well, because obviously when we start looking at neuroscience in leadership, we learn that brains are different in terms of neuroscience, which gives us more of a conversation around that as well.
Yeah, and I would say, on top of that, neuroleadership, to me, it sounds like they're combining neuroscience, they're combining a little bit of social psychology, they're combining a little bit of business and industrial, organizational psychology, but it's kind of a combination of all of it. You get the best of all the worlds, it looks like, with this.
So what did they find?
Yeah, so in terms of the results, they talk about a figure where it's figure 1, I believe. It's a diagram, it's talking about the most influential topics, and they kind of highlight the neuroscience, the strategic management behind it. They provide that theoretical, that academic foundation, it looks like, for the literature on neuroleadership. So the leadership part mainly developed from management literature, while the concept of neuroleadership kind of came from application of both neuroscience and leadership. They note it's interesting because, it's a detail of the networks of both of the topics kind of combined.
Yeah. And I guess from their perspective, this paper is maybe not giving us, they're sort of saying that what this would allow us to do is it would allow us to have a better way to understand happiness. And so from their perspective, what recommendations did they give with regards to happiness based on quite a lot? If you look at the paper, you'll see there's a lot of different, factor analysis kind of graphs here. So like, what did they recommend in terms of happiness based on their focus on neuroleadership?
Yeah, so they touch on, how this role of neuroleadership can play in happiness management and can affect it. I really saw, how this paper talked about the positive working climate and how to foster that within the companies using these management models, stimulating the happiness of their employees in their day-to-day kind of performance, as well as their professional activities and things of that nature. I also thought it was interesting, they point out how previous literature kind of touches on the different aspects, different effects of leadership, as well as types of kind of employee well-being and happiness within the workplace kind of environment. So the positive effects of, happiness at work have been found, for different types of leadership styles, different types of leaderships, overall with different people. There's the virtuous leadership, inspirational, things like that, authentic leadership, ethical leadership, and it just kind of goes on. So so it's definitely kind of leading into the transformational leadership.
Which we haven't talked about on this podcast yet, but we are going to talk about the connection between ADHD and transformational leadership. Honestly, just because one of the questions I've been getting when I go on podcasts is like, people never think about it, but a lot of the people who have ADHD are leaders in their spaces. And if that's you, we see you, and we're going to try and find some research on what you can do. But yeah, very cool. Very cool to see this shift in the way we think about the workplace, and hopefully connecting it to the previous paper, a shift in how we if we take into account neuroscience, it's going to be harder for people to say that everybody just acts the way that the boss thinks that people act because that's how they act, which can sometimes be the case. And I think we're a lot better than that now, but we used to be pretty, it really depended on the team leader, I think was the conversation we always said.
Yeah, that's definitely important. Knowing that you may be a team leader, but you're not going to be exactly like the rest of the team, right? There's going to be some differences in how we lead and how we kind of follow as well on the other end.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, let's jump into the next paper. So this paper is about a different kind of space where, people could be struggling. So previously we were talking about leaders in a business. This is about being the entrepreneur. So this is ADHD symptoms and entrepreneurship orientation and firm performance. It's from Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. So I'm really curious to see what their method section looks like. And basically, they wanted to investigate the relationship between ADHD symptoms and entrepreneurship. So finding out what impact it had on entrepreneurs in general. So they used, a couple of samples, and what they were looking at was what is happening in this space. Is there benefits to being neurodiverse, having ADHD, if you're in entrepreneurship in terms of your performance? So a different kind of leadership here. How did they go about doing this, Taylor?
With their method section, they kind of talk about two different samples of entrepreneurs from both the United States and then Spain. They split it into two ones. So the first study, I would say, is cross-sectional. So that relies on the single informants, uses self-perceived measures for the independent and the dependent variables.
So when you say, because we always like to make that note, self-perceived measures, what did they ask people? Like, do you think you have ADHD?
Not necessarily.
We just need to check because sometimes that is how they do it.
I don't remember reading that actually. Let me go.
Yeah. Like how did they find out that these people had ADHD?
I will say that a lot of the research does talk about that when you're talking about ADHD. They'll say, do you have ADHD? Do we have to confirm a diagnosis and things like that? But not all papers do. So that is an important question.
Especially because this is another paper that is not from psychology, which is where we usually get our papers from. We're diving out of our space today. So I want to make sure we get the theory right.
Yes, of course. So they talked about, they received a total of, over 400 responses, which 300 plus respondents answered more than 50% of all the questions. So they used mostly those.
Yeah. What were the questions?
Talk about demographics. So where are you located? The average age, average year of work experience, median sales, median number of employees. They don't give the specific questions, though. They mostly focus on what are your demographics? What does your business look like? It seems from their sample.
Okay. So we'll chalk it up to departmental differences. They don't have as much methodology, but like I said, this is a different kind of department. So we will give that to them.
I will say, you scroll down a bit, you talk a little bit more about the measures. For the independent, they do use the ADHD self-report scale. So so they definitely do ADHD symptoms for that. Yeah. I would hope that they had done that.
Yeah. Well, you just want to check. I think the worst paper that Sarah and I ever had was somebody had teachers and they just asked the teachers if the kids looked like they had ADHD. And that was how they figured it out.
My goodness.
Yeah, that was peer-reviewed published. So we always want to just double check. So yeah, interesting. So they gave them an ADHD scale, and obviously it's still not from psychiatrists or things like that, but that can be very hard to do.
I wish they did a little bit of a deeper dive into it. They did. I mean, there's a lot that goes into the ethical kind of regulations of that information.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think definitely with these kinds of papers, it is really interesting to find out how we get the methodology. I think that's one of the reasons people listen to us is because they know they're going to get peer reviewed and we're going to be honest about how the papers came and how they relate to ADHD. But I will say, if you're a management paper, you'll be publishing in a management journal or an entrepreneurship journal, and they will have different expectations about how much space is allowed for different sections. So this might be something that they had written in depth in their own private paper, but in terms of what was actually published, it wasn't able to be included. So it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just not something we have access to right now.
Got it. So back to study one, it's the cross-sectional. They talk about their measures being both dependent and the independent variables. In terms of the dependent, they focus on two specific ones in terms of their dimensions. So the subjective kind of firm performance, which was measured, with the rating of profits, the sales development, cash flow, and market value, and things like that. And then with the opposite, which was the objective firm performance, which includes their current sales and their employment, as well as,
Interesting.
just the basis of information regarding their annual growth rates and things like that.
Oh, that's interesting that they included that. That's very cool. So what did they find about ADHD?
Well, their overall paper kind of cites that their evidence points towards the impulsive and the hyperactive symptoms of ADHD were largely conductive to firm performance throughout entrepreneurial, orientation, or they say EO, while inattentive symptoms are just not.
So does that mean if you have ADHD, you are more likely to perform better as a business owner?
I would say it's split. If you have the more impulsive hyperactive symptom section of ADHD, maybe you'll perform a little bit better.
Interesting.
And lead some into that entrepreneurial action and things like that. While inattentive symptoms, you might not do so good.
That's interesting. I will say this is probably the first time that there's a positive. Usually we're talking about the negatives and how to work around them. It's really interesting that is something that comes up here as a positive. And honestly, that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring it up in this conversation about burnout, because we can often talk about how to manage at work and the burnout at work. It's nice to have a paper that talks about a space where the work you do and the way you do it might actually be a benefit.
I agree. I think just because, this isn't the most recent paper we've collected from our discussion today, but it does kind of show that growth in kind of our understanding of ADHD and how some symptoms may display differently while on a different kind of career path. And they talk about that, and their limitations for this research. They specifically highlight the survivor bias, which is essentially, the sample selection bias, where a researcher may mistake a visible success kind of from a subgroup and say, oh, that applies to the entire group of people, which it doesn't. It's wrong, essentially. So, they kind of suggest for future research to do more of a comparison study, collecting sample of more representative entrepreneurs or just a sample of entrepreneurs at different stages in their work.
Yeah, that's a huge difference. Yeah. Stuck in that early stage before you get that hockey stick growth, 100%. Okay. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of today's episode. If you were to give me, Taylor, one thing that you think people could take away from the chat we've had today, what do you think it is?
When I'm kind of assessing the benefits of what are people going to get out of this research, I think the biggest one that we discussed was, from the Gabriel study, which is the breakdown of the organizational level changes, the suggestions, which is, providing that stress intervention, allowing the employees to be a bit more active in their work. And again, cultivating that social support to increase the performance management and things like that. So I think that would be the biggest thing they would get out of this, just to look into those real actionable strategies and create that healthier workplace.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. If your supervisors or boss are asking you how to support people and deal with burnout and neurodiversity in the workplace, just send them that paper. We'll be linking it. So just send them that paper and it's going to be like, go to this page. These are the recommendations based on research. So I agree with you. I also think that the last piece about how, entrepreneurship can be a benefit if it's the ADHD, just because we don't talk about the benefits that often. And if you guys do want more in depth on that, I actually did a paper a while ago with the wonderful John Torrens from Syracuse University. We wrote something on my website about the benefits of ADHD in entrepreneurship. So if you want that, maybe we'll link down to that as well. But that is it for us. So thank you so much, Taylor, for putting your voice on the internet. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was a fun time.
Awesome. I'm glad you had fun. And we will see you guys all in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for listening, everyone. And a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discussed, head on over to our show notes page because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting, and you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.